Welcome everybody to February's Finance and Resources Committee. And as usual, we will, agenda item 1 will be the minutes from the previous meeting, which were attached. Can I have agreement to sign those from everybody? Great, thank you. Apologies for absence. We have apologies tonight from councillors Capozzi, Silwall, Weston and Reynolds. So we know that Councillor Patterson is substituting for Councillor Reynolds. Welcome, Councillor Patterson. And I'm going to say welcome to Councillor Duras. Thank you. Okay, well, we'll express our tolerance for Councillor Duras' presence.
I've had worse.
Okay, public participation, there is none because we have a singular item tonight. Consideration for any matters called in, there is none. And then we'll move on to action points from the previous meeting, and I'm delighted to once again be able to say that there are none. So well done, officers, on being able to attend things so promptly the last few meetings. On that note, this is agenda item 7, my little usual rant that I seem to be having. Still getting very little requests on the work programme. We have a couple of very detailed meetings coming up, but there have so far been no requests by councillors for additional deep dives or projects going forward. So I really want to nudge people on that. Officers, sorry, I know I'm doing a soapbox, but officers have just done some really amazing presentations to councillors about various future strategies, which obviously do affect on us. We've got, for example, the leisure strategy was from the other week. Please, if there are things there that you are interested in, talk to me, talk to Trudy. Let's give the officers a chance to bring that information forward and, you know, show what we are interested in hearing more about. Right, soapbox over. We'll get on to the main and single item of tonight's agenda. Number 8, budget 25-26, and over to Nigel.
Good evening, committee. I'm not going to keep you a long time in terms of presentation this evening, but just a bit of background of how we've got to where we are at the moment. We presented a draft budget to all the scrutiny committees in early December, based on the MTFS and other service planning documents that have gone on throughout 2024. And we've gone through a process from there to now where very little in the budget has changed. Hence, we've got a reduced scrutiny function this evening. And what we'll go through and what is in our pack is the draft 25-26 budget. We did allude to a few, or I alluded to a few financial changes in terms of funding from government in January scrutiny, but other than that, there's been no significant service changes to the proposals discussed by this committee and other scrutinies in December. Hence why there's a very kind of light touch presentation. But I'm going to bring you up to speed with a couple of things that are happening around the sector that are relevant to our 25-26 budget proposal. So, first of all, it has been quite a chaotic week in the council. On Monday, we got the final local government finance settlement, which was discussed in Parliament today. The good news is, from my perspective, the numbers were pretty much in line with where we're at the moment. The headlines as a whole country is that they're saying there's a 6.8% cash terms, so not real terms, increase in what we refer to as core spending power, which is business rates retained, council tax and some random grants, including new homes bonus, of which we get very few. That's the picture for the whole of the country. That large 6.8% increase is predominantly driven by council tax increases and increases in care funding, be it adults and children's. So no new money, no additional to the sector as a whole. New homes bonus confirmed to continue for one more year for 25-26, which we have in our budget. Some grants were removed. Again, we've discussed those previously. And some authorities have been able to get additional funding through deprivation which has not been a particularly good outcome for shire districts who have not factored particularly high on the Edaki deprivation index. They've also confirmed that there'll be a full business rate reset for 26-27. The headline of what that means is if you're retaining any growth from your business rates, you won't be able to in 26-27 because they'll set the baseline of whatever your income is at the moment. So we've got that factored into our MTFS, so it doesn't have any impact on us. But it was good to get that confirmation from government. One aspect of funding that we have got previously, one grant, is called the Minimum Funding Guarantee, which they've now called the funding floor. For those that remember the 24-5 budget, that meant that we were guaranteed at least an increase in our budget of 4%. The floor was set at 0% this year. So you can work out we're getting no additional income because we are one of the funding authorities that are on the floor. Just showing this table at the bottom, just to show that actually every district that's on the funding floor is a district and predominantly shire districts. So you can see that the overall funding is very much skewed to authorities not like ourselves. And this gives you a further breakdown of the whole sector in terms of where they're at. There is one big outlier, unfortunately, it is us, on average receiving 0.3 is what that says, apologies, 0.3% increase in core funding year on year. For us, it is 0%. So, we're probably the runt of the litter on a very poor sector. So again, I put the CPI in there just to show that actually, when it comes to real terms impact, we are getting less funding than we are doing proportionally compared to 24-25. What did that mean for us in terms of our budget and our budget assumptions? Again, this is a slide, this is an old slide from December's Scrutiny. No changes there in terms of what we had. We do have an increase in tax base, but the tax base has started at a much lower position than we expected, as discussed at Cabinet in December. And we've put the inflationary assumptions in there, as you can see on the table. But again, nothing new to what we discussed at Scrutiny in December. What does this mean in terms of numbers, which is the key, particularly for members? So there you can see how we've got inflationary increases in costs related to pay predominantly, but also inflation on some of our service areas. Second half of the slide says how we've delivered that. Again, no changes from where we're at in the draft position in December, but predominantly driving it through income generation. Parking, garages, discretionary fees are the three key areas. Again, in terms of that strategy, which we've outlined in our draft budget proposals and is in the pack this evening for the 25-26 budget, is no significant change on what we've done for the last 3 years. You can see there our core funding growth, which is the red bar chart, is low. Our inflation and service pressures is high. We've had to fill that gap with savings and income generation. It's what we've used for the 3 years up to 24-5, and it's the basis of the budget that's in front of you this evening. Literally, that is it for me this evening. There is not a lot more to add. I didn't want to waste members' times making things up that members were already aware of. But I'm obviously open to answer any questions or queries. And this is probably a good time for some of you, for me to introduce Claire Dempsey to some of you that may not know, who is at the moment acting up as our Head of Financial Services and took over from Peony Jump in December. And Claire has been at the authority for a few years, let's say, and knows a lot of the budget areas far better than myself. So hopefully, depending on the questions, she'll be able to get involved and help us resolve it.
Thank you, Nigel. I will open the floor to questions. We've got Councillor Patterson.
That's a very new thing, but you've now got local government reorganisation into the mix. And I was wondering how there's bound to be some things we'll have to pay for in the coming year. I wondered how that was going to be sorted out, whether you were going to have just pay from reserves if you have question consulting the public will cost a fair bit of money. I expect that we do that. And employing consultants, meeting with other people, other councils, and having open days, things like that.
Yeah, you're entirely right. Obviously, the devolution debate started heavily just before Christmas and is carrying on. We are working with partners across Hertfordshire and wider afield in terms of what devolution will mean. That will incur costs, you're right. As an organisation, I suspect at this point, because we're still developing our plan, that we will want to consult with residents, with businesses, with other authorities around the area in terms of the strategic authority, even outside of Hertfordshire. There will be a cost. It will be a one-off cost. So the likelihood is we will be looking at reserves to finance some of that. Equally, we'll look to do a lot of that work with our partners, be it Herts County Council or district partners, to make sure that we can get good value for money. Once we've got a plan in terms of what's required, and some members may be away today, a letter has winged its way about 2 hours ago into officers' boxes from Jim McMahon, Secretary of State, giving some guidance on the first kind of submission into central government. That will let us understand between now and the spring what we're expected to do, and we can put a cost package around that. But it will involve probably external consultants to come in to do some polling of residents and businesses, but also consultants to work up any models that we need to do as part of that. But we are working collectively with our other partners in terms of planning for that, and that will be in earnest and go through the usual channels in terms of how we're going to finance that.
Thanks. Thank you. Councillor Guest.
Thank you, Chairman. Looking at page 90 of the report pack, it is disappointing that the green bin charge is being increased by 10% when it brought in more than expected. So what efficiencies was it looked at, what efficiencies could be carried out to avoid a need to increase the green bin charge?
So in terms of green bins, the large amount of the income that we raised by that increase is going on the cost of the delivery. In terms of the cost of delivery, it's increasing significantly, both from a combination of the staffing side of that. In terms of the pay award, it's significantly higher for that quarter of staff, something like 6.5% this year, likely to be similar next year. Equally, the cost of the vehicles, the inflation on some of the fuel and the utilities that we're using, and the cost of disposal is going up as well. So although you see a big increase in the cost, it's because the cost of delivering that service has increased. And equally, the green bin service is still a concessionary service. It is still bringing in less income than it costs to deliver. So from that perspective, when we're looking at all our budgets, we have to look at how we can balance our budget, but equally how certain services, particularly discretionary services, should be, where possible, wiping their face, because they are discretionary by nature, and we have to do our statutory services first. This is one where members have been very keen, and this administration and the previous one, that we did want it to be a concessionary service, and it still is at the moment. As part of that process, we did review how that's been delivered. We've looked at different ways of delivering it. We've looked at expanding it as well in terms of delivering it over a longer time.
I think it's quite rude to have another conversation going on in the room while someone's speaking. Apologies.
So from that perspective, a lot of options were looked at.
Chairman, could Nigel repeat his sort of last paragraph or so, because I couldn't hear quite clearly because there was another meeting going on to the left of me.
That's fine. So as part of the process of the fees and charges, it was a 6-month process, we looked at how that service could be delivered in a different way, how it could be done more efficiently, more effectively. One of those options was to pick up less frequently, and the options were not options that as an organisation we wanted to take forward because we felt that they would be to the detriment of the residents. So from that perspective, it wasn't just a case of let's increase it, there were lots of options looked at.
Thank you.
I'm just going to come to Councillor Allen.
Apologies, I was just trying to find out a bit of detail. I just thought it might be helpful to share that there was a full review of all of the bin lorry rounds, and a number of bin rounds were able to be lost through more efficiencies, and we were able to reduce the number of bin lorries that we have in our fleet. So there has been look at efficiencies to minimise the number of bin lorries and the number of rounds that are being conducted by those lorries.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Okay, so Councillor Deacon will be next, and then we'll come to Councillor.
Yes. Apologies, I should have picked this up in the sort of scrutiny stage a little while ago, but page 31. Might be a silly question, but I'm told it might help other people like me that are relatively new to all this. Page 31 is a table, and if I just go on the finance resources I'll use supplies and services just as an example. We've got a figure of 4.1, which is an original, forecast of 5.1, the draft of 4.3. Now, I guess there's a couple of questions, observations. There's a gap, and how we've learned, especially this evening, things are pretty tight. Is that a challenge? But when you look at the variance, shouldn't we be looking at a risk of what the forecast versus what you're proposing is, rather than what the original and the draft is? Are you with me? Because it's 25% rather than 5.
It's a very good question. Forecasts are always very useful as part of our budget setting process. And the first thing we always do in terms of the budget setting is we look at the current year budget and the current year actuals and reflect what we think will carry forward in the future year. The detail then often means there's some costs that may be a one-off cost that are incurred in one year that won't be incurred in another. And in terms of this area with supplies and services, we've got increased one-off costs in 24/5, which we don't believe will continue into 25/6, which is why you can see that the budget for 25/6 is higher than 24/5, but not in line with the forecast for this year.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Williams.
Thank you. I'll just try to find the page, but the budget assumptions shows use of interest for 25/26 of 1.148 million. So how does that compare with the actual interest received, and where does the difference go?
So in year, we've been receiving, in terms of 24/25, we've received something like £3 million in interest received, compared to a budget of about £1 million this year. We are expecting, and if you look at the Treasury Management Report, you'll see that the cash flow for the council, the cash balances are rescinding over the next few years, partly because of the significant capital programme, over 60 million this year and next year being spent, which is eroding some of those cash balances. And so we're expecting less cash balances going forward, hence a lower return. We're also projecting to get lower interest rate returns on those investments. That's an area where, again, I think I've commented in some of my comments in the main body of the report, is a little bit up in the air, because interest rate forecasting at the moment is very, very difficult given the wider global economic position. So for those that aren't aware, in terms of our cash balances at the moment, we've got about 100 million. So if we're out by 1% on our interest rate projections, that's £1 million more than we will receive. Hence why we're seeing significantly more this year. In terms of where any additional proceeds will go, Councillor Williams, at the year end, we will make allocations to reserves if we are in a surplus position. At the moment for 24/5, we reported at Q2 a surplus position, primarily due to Treasury returns, and that has grown up to Q3 as well. So there is an expectation at year end there will be an allocation to reserves from that increased income.
Thank you. I think you've mastered the British art of understatement there with regards to some of the uncertainties about what's happening in very recent times. Councillor Stevens.
On business rates, just remind us, what's the multiplier that we're talking about here?
So it's a great question. Strap yourself in. So what businesses get when they get a calculation for their business rates, they get a rateable value. So if you've got a property, the rateable value for that property is £10,000. But then they use a multiplier dependent on what that property is used for. So what you're referring to is the small business rates multiplier. There are several ones, and they take the £10,000 and they times it by, say, 0.5 is the multiplier. And that works out what your actual tax bill is. So if it is 50%, you pay £5,000 on something with a rateable value of £10,000. And you get multipliers for small businesses, and a lot of rate relief is done through multipliers. But your big organisations don't get a multiplier, so they have to pay the full impact of things like supermarkets and your larger organisations. It's a way of trying to take a business rate system which isn't perfect and make it more viable for particularly smaller businesses.
Right, thank you.
Councillor Williams.
I'm going to put you on the spot here, Nigel. It strikes me that the budget generally is hugely dependent upon raising additional income and almost entirely no savings in our core budget. In your view, is that a sustainable position? Because we're really milking the golden goose of car parking and garage rents and waste. What challenge does that give us for future years?
There is a balanced budget in front of you for 25/6, which is heavily reliant on income generation. Going forward, do I believe that income generation is going to resolve the £2.1 million, say, of MTFS savings in the next 3 years? No, I don't. I think we've got to a point now where our income generation is probably maximised. That does not mean we will not be looking at our fees and charges and some of those income generating services and trying to maximise. And Catherine's leading on the commercial income review, which will look at a lot of those service areas to maximise that. Do I think they will play a significant role in our budget for 26 onwards? No, I don't. I think the council will have to look at efficiencies, cost cutting and other areas that we can look to balance the budget in the medium term. So it is sustainable for 1 year. It's probably not sustainable to assume that that will continue to grow in the medium term.
I'll just throw a follow on that one. Given the sort of state of local government finance across the country, do we think that the requirement to deliver a balanced budget for councils that have reserves is going to stay sacrosanct as it is at the moment? Do you feel there's any chance that that may be relaxed in future years?
The short answer is no. I think if anything, given government devolution, if the government's going to go anyway, it will be more stringent policy on what you spend and how you spend it. Because we're in a period potentially 2, 3, 4 years, depending on who you speak to, where authorities have a certain amount of uncertainty around what the future is. And that can tend to lead to bigger decisions being made that wouldn't normally be made. And so there's like to be a moving policy more stringent to what we can or can't do. From my perspective, you know, particularly my Section 151 role, which is a small element, I very rarely say that, we need to be financially sustainable and we need to be that in the medium term and stand on our own 2 feet. Yes, we can use our reserves appropriately and invest in services for residents, but we can't use our reserves to balance the budget. 1, we can't in statute, and 2, I can't sign off as a medium-term sustainability solution in terms of using reserves for that basis.
Okay, thank you. Do we have further questions? I do realise we are basically addressing the entire budget in one block rather than sort of moving it through, but I haven't had a swamp of questions. So I'll move to Councillor Stevens.
Still on business rates. In 4.6, we're talking about the pool. Just clarify for me, we're talking about there's £500,000 in funding to decorum that's been included, okay? And you're telling us that we've got, are we likely to lose this £500,000 going forward?
So there's 2 aspects to this. For the committee, decorum is part of a Hertfordshire pool in 24-25, which is agreed upon every year. There is a huge technical process, and what happens, for whatever reason, highly technical, all the authorities in decorum in Hertfordshire can't be in it. There's normally 3, 4 or 5. We were one of those councils in 24-25. What being in the pool does is it means you can retain more of the growth in business rates than when you're not in the pool. So again, slightly technical, but it's a baseline of what you've got to collect. For us, let's say it's 100 million, slightly more, and we have to give nearly all of it back to government. But if we grow above that, normally we're allowed to keep about 20%. When you're in the pool, you're allowed to keep 40%. So whilst we're in the pool, we retain more growth. We have seen some growth in business rates, so we're able to retain more. 2 reasons why it comes back out of the budget and it's a one-off. 1, because we're not due to be in the pool in 25-26, again, because of the technical way that it's calculated, and it's done independently by an organisation that Hertfordshire councils pay for, so it's not a case of favouritism, it's all done by a technical accountancy firm. And secondly, because of what I mentioned earlier on in the presentation around business rates being reset. So basically what happened is normally you keep the growth, your baseline is set, and every year over 3 years, you grow, you get to retain some of your growth in that baseline, and then next year, they're resetting the baseline up there. So we remove all the growth, and then in subsequent years, we might get growth that we can retain, but for 1 year, you're back down to your baseline position.
Right. So
You understood all that?
Yes, I'm with you.
I'm already very impressed because it is very technical. I've tried to deliver it in a very transparent way.
Okay, right. So the £500,000, does that drop out of the equation?
It does. It drops out of the budget from 26-27.
Okay.
Unless in the spring, when the government does the fair funding review and decides exactly how local authorities are going to be financed in the medium term, and hopefully we get a medium term settlement, they may provide funds to fill that gap. It's very unlikely because growth has always been seen as a short-term win for authorities. We've got £500,000 of growth in there for next year. There's another Hertfordshire one that has 5 times that. So you can see the problems that some authorities will be having when that baseline is reset.
Right. Oh dear.
Okay, Councillor Guest.
Thank you, Chairman. Looking at paragraph 3.7 on page 11 of the reports pack, it states that the base growth in council tax was assumed as 1%, but the actual base growth in 24-25 was only 0.4%. So how was that assumption of a council tax base growth of 1% arrived at?
So the council tax base growth is arrived at using 2 elements. Firstly, is looking at the previous 5 years' growth and the average growth that's attained, supplemented with information from our planners in terms of what developments are due to take place and finalise in Decorum in one financial year. The issue being, off the back of the moratorium that took place, we saw less growth initially in terms of the start of 24-25, and now we're in a position where all-round development in the whole of the UK is far more costly, and developers are finding it much harder to deliver those sites. So they're either not starting or not completing them. Hence, we had much lower growth in 24-5 than we'd originally estimated. We are assuming at the moment there's still 1% in 5-6 because we're seeing slight green shoots. We're seeing a lot of additional planning income, which is coming through the monitoring reports because there's a lot more planning interest. And again, liaising with planners, they believe that 1% should be achievable.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll throw a question of my own in while we queue up. Going to jump into the capital bids. Thanks for all the detail in there. It's, that I found quite interesting reading. There's 2 observations, and I may even be coming to Catherine on this one. So the first is, obviously, we've got a lot of capital bids for the next financial year, but very little going into future years, which is somewhat surprising. The other thing is, I'm not going to promise that I know exactly what all of these are. The things like this, the service road resurfacing, I'm quite interested in. But if I was to pull out from that list all of the ones that I think are the potential of what I call invest to save, where we're expecting the investment to either bring down our running costs or generate some other income, I don't see very many of them there. So is that a fair assessment? And what are we doing internally to try to make sure that we're encouraging and driving those innovations and using our investment potential where we possibly can? So the key word here is probably timing. And you are entirely correct in your assumption. There isn't a huge amount of new in there. Part of that is because 3 or 4 of the main strategic drivers at the moment that will bring that are at a place where at the moment we don't have those projections. So for instance, you have got the strategic asset review, which will be delivered to members over the next few months in terms of the outline of the initial findings and what the next steps are. That will drive investment in commercial property, in garages, in housing neighbourhoods, etc. over a long period of time. So we're not in a point where we've got that yet, but it will be coming very shortly. You've got the commercial income review, which again is looking at some more services this year that might require some capex investment to help pump prime what they're going to do in the next stages. Again, not quite at that point yet. We have reviewed some in year, like the light industrial, that was something that didn't stack up commercially, so that's now out of the project. And thirdly, you've got the investment partnership, which we're hoping to have a partner on board by the summer, at which point they'll be looking at development plans for some of the sites, the key sites around Decorum, which will look at investment in the medium term. So partly it's timing. We've got all those things in place. Oh, the other one, I have forgotten one, the big one, that the numbers are in there, and that's the leisure strategy, which will be back in the next few months to members in terms of looking how we invest in our whole leisure portfolio going forward over the medium term. At the moment, it's not been confirmed, but we are in initial discussions around
bringing the MTFS forward to the summer, which will be supported with an investment strategy, a treasury strategy and a capital strategy. So we'll redo some of these strategies based on the fact that they could fundamentally change. So it is partly timing as to why you've not seen that big CapEx investment in the short term. And one of the points that Councillor Patson raised earlier, which is very poignant here, is devolution. We now need a probably 2-3 year capital programme that's very focused on what we can deliver in that period, given things are likely to change, and hence trying to bring that forward to members, hopefully by the summer, informally or formally, so that we can focus on the delivery of that. Is going to be the next kind of focal point.
Okay, so I'm going to sort of sum up what I've heard on that, which is that we're certainly still considering all of those things that we've spoken about. It's mainly a timing categorisation between this is a bid rather than, you know, you've probably got a pot of money that you're expecting to be drawn on as officers sort of move things into specific bids for these sites. Okay.
I suspect the capital programme will significantly increase over the next 12 months.
Thank you. Councillor Douris, I'm guessing you're going to hit us with 3 questions to...
No. I'm really going to offer an observation, looking at my friendly Appendix M, and the very disappointing responses to the public consultation of 204. And I'm guessing, and I may be wrong, that the various service entries might have been pre-populated, but the numbers are pretty much the same year on year. And I just wonder whether it would be helpful to ask one additional question next time, which would be, did you respond to the last questionnaire? Because it just makes me feel as though it's probably the same 190 people who are responding every time, and therefore we're really only getting their view, and it's the same every year. And it would be good to see, rightly or wrongly, a variation.
I wouldn't disagree. I always like to start these conversations with a positive. It's about 12% increase year on year. So from that perspective, you know, stepping in the right direction. What I would say is, I'm not going to say here that we've got a material number feeding back that gives us any real substance. We are working with the administration, the leader and the portfolio holder to develop a more developed comms strategy over the next 12 months, which is hopefully going to get people more engaged, involve more consultation. I suspect there'll be a lot more polling, Devo and various other things, which hopefully will get people more interested and more engaged in local authorities. What I would say is we have had some consultations this year, you know, venture playgrounds ones and things like that. They've had some fantastic responses. And I have to sit here, unfortunately, admit that finance and budgets isn't the sexiest consultation for residents to get involved in. We need to make it a little bit more glamorous and a little bit more increase in terms of inclusivity, because again, we need to know who's doing it. I really like your idea, putting the question of who's responded before. I think that will really add some substance to it. But I'd like to think that we're sitting here next year, probably with a different consultation methodology, with a lot more feedback, because we're all here for residents, and getting their feedback on that is absolutely critical. What I would say is the messaging, although it may be the same people, is very similar year on year in terms of what they think is really important. And I think this committee has already raised some of those aspects. Waste collection always comes very, very high. So hopefully more engagement and consultation with different subsets and a bit more communications from officers and members will drive more inclusive involvement next year.
Thank you. I agree with the suggestion and I agree with the response. I was just going to go completely outside my expertise and talk like I know anything about consultations. Obviously, communication stuff will come in. But there are certain consultations that the way you read them is almost by exception. So in some ways, the fact that you're getting a similar level of things from last year is sort of saying that nobody is extremely disappointed by something that we've done recently or thinking we've gone in a different direction. When you suddenly see a big spike in those things and everybody's on one side, it's usually caused because there's like one decision or one issue for that. Again, I don't know what I'm talking about, but that's my observation.
Yeah, I would, I've accepted that the volume is not a huge amount of people, but question 5 and that 77% of residents feel that they are getting good value for money from what they're paying in terms of their council tax. I think is something that all members of any political description can be pleased with.
Thank you. Councillor Stevens.
Right. On page 72 into strategic planning and the budget there, we've got the examination public coming up, which is likely to absorb a fair degree of resource. Have we got enough in the budget to cover the costs that are going to be involved in the examination, etc.?
I believe so. We've got a baseline budget and we've got a reserve. So from that perspective, I would like to think that we've got enough funding to deliver that.
I'm not seeing any further hands. That is going to make things a very short meeting, so I'll just give one last call if anybody's got any questions at all. You can ask the officers for their favourite pasta recipes if you want. Oh, Councillor Patterson.
My favourite part is Rights Away, and I was wondering where that fits in on here, because I can't see a specific right search for Rights Away. It's not there.
I'm not entirely sure, but I can come back to you in terms of what we spend on rights of ways and management. It will be in the environment budget, but I'm not entirely sure where.
Councillor Guest.
Chairman, I believe that rights of way are a county council responsibility.
No. Decorum deal with it in Hertfordshire.
I can come back on the details. I know we get involved in some disputes and some piece of land, but a lot of it is driven by Hertfordshire County Council.
Rights Away officer called Clayton Ray.
Yes, I know him.
And,
well,
so there is a responsibility. And as I'm around it, you see, so I hear that there's been a lot of cutbacks in that department. So I was trying to see on here.
Well, I can assure you that Clayton Ray has been employed for the 6 years I've been here, and he's still in the budget for 25-26. So there's not going to be a reduction in the direct cost in terms of what's supported there. But he does do many other things as well.
Councillor Bromman.
Yeah, just to say that I expect that would be in the open spaces section under SPAY, but it would be quite useful if that sort of thing was broken out. I agree, so we can see more detail.
I will circle back to Mark Brooks's presentation of the scrutiny proposals at the last meeting. One of the things that I was quite keen on, and that sounds like a very good tie-in to here, is effectively a scrutiny portal that would have the reports available to councillors, but would also have the detail behind the reports, allowing people to drill down into the levels of detail like that. So people like me who like spreadsheets are sort of able to get a full understanding of things without necessarily needing the council, the officers to deliver that detail. So that's my little nudge on for that. Councillor Williams.
It seems you've invited more questions. On page 18 going into 19, there's the Decorum Development Reserve, and it lists 5 areas of expenditure from that reserve. One of which is 122k to review of council trees to develop a tree management strategy. How does that tick a box of development and economic development?
Well,
is it in the right box, or is it just convenient there's some money there that we can nick to do the job?
Well, in terms of development, a lot of the trees are around a lot of our land and houses. So from that perspective, I suppose it could be linked. Is there a more appropriate reserve? Potentially. That was a decision that I think was agreed at Cabinet in November or December. So I can go back and check the Cabinet approval in terms of why it was linked to that reserve.
And it doesn't seem to tick the criteria of that reserve.
Are either of our Cabinet members au fait with that and able to answer today? Otherwise, we'll probably need to come back. Yeah. So it's quite a detailed question. I wouldn't imagine coming in with it, but I thought it was worth asking.
All I can say about the trees is that the service is underfunded. They're only able to do emergency type work. It would be very good if there was more budget available to do more proactive kind of work. And it has been commented, you know, when people have suggested planting more trees, the officers have said that there isn't enough funds to maintain the ones we've already got.
I wouldn't disagree with that. I'm just querying whether economic development is the right place to fund a tree survey, or whether we're fudging it because there happens to be some money there.
We could go back and look at that decision, make sure it meets the need of the reserve.
Hooray, we've got something on the list for actions for next meeting, but I suspect that'll be, I suspect there'll be an email coming out to answer that one, because it should be a case of checking the cabinet notes. Councillor Patterson.
On that, that paragraph mentions regeneration, so referring to Councillor Bronman trying to do some tree regeneration, planting new ones, and that's obviously why it's there, I think, rather than somewhere else.
So part of what that money is funding is to develop a strategy of tree management going forward. What that strategy will be, we will wait and see. Will that require additional funding going forward? Possibly. I think we need to understand what the short and the medium term need is. There has been increased investment in trees over the last 2 years in terms of what the service has been spending, and there's been a lot more reviews in terms of trees and tree safety. So from that perspective, there's a huge amount more work going on than what was previously, and I imagine the strategy will outline how we'll deliver it in the medium term.
You're going to hate me for asking this, especially because I know the tree strategy is not going to be an area of your expertise. Is there a possibility that tree strategy is looking at doing tree management for other councils that we, especially those we may have been in business with in the past?
Not that I'm aware of at the moment. It's more focusing on our trees, the quality of our trees, and the impact of ash dieback is the main part of that strategy in terms of how we manage that. It's about making sure that we can look after the trees that we have first. It may be a supplementary, but I'm not aware of it.
Fantastic. Personally, I'm reassured to hear that. Any further questions? No? Well, thank you, Nigel, and to all your team for the report. Very well presented. And I will call the meeting over.